going to talk about John Bunyan and also about Puritanism. We really live in the golden age of the Puritans. We're going to find out that by some measure they've all been dead for a long time, but we probably have more access to Puritan works and books than they even did when all the Puritans were alive. Banner of Truth, published decades ago, and we have some of them in our book nook, a whole series, 40-plus volumes of Puritan paperbacks. Many of you will know the name of Joel Beakey from Reformation Heritage Books and from Puritan Reformed Theological Seminary in Grand Rapids. They're constantly republishing the Puritans. He has a big book, and it has a new cover now, and they're coming out with a new edition, so you might want to just wait a few months till the new edition. But Meet the Puritans. You can see there's a lot of Puritans to meet in this book. This is a big 900-page, so there's it's like 10 pages on a whole bunch of Puritans, a little biography, and then they go over some of the major works. So there's this. If you want, this is a nice scholarly but largely sympathetic book on the Puritans, the Cambridge Companion to Puritanism. I'm partial to this. One of the editors, well, the editors are John Coffey, he was my doctoral supervisor, and Paul Lim, who was at Gordon Conwell for a time when I was there, and then he went to Vanderbilt. Great day to be in Vanderbilt. The Puritans, just keeping with very big books, the Puritans, A Transatlantic History, they're thick pages, so it's not as intimidating. This is a nice book about 10 years ago, The Devoted Life, an invitation to Puritan classics. So again, there's just a short biography and then maybe 15 or 20 Puritan works, and they give a brief introduction. The great thing about this book is the chapter on John Bunyan is from J.I. Packer. And it just doesn't get any better than J.I. Packer on the Puritans, such a good writer. Speaking of J.I. Packer, if you wanted to just read one thing on the Puritans, this book was reissued a few years ago by Crossway, A Quest for Godliness, The Puritan Vision of the Christian Life by J.I. Packer. He is such a good writer, of course, went to be with the Lord a few years ago. This is a collection of chapters and essays and other things, but a vision for the Christian life. And then prize for the best title, and I'll explain the title. You'll understand the title better when we get into the lecture. But this came out, it's not all that sympathetic to the Puritans, but it's a very good work. It's called Hot Protestants, A History of Puritanism in England and America. So good Christmas gift, say, honey, I saw this book, I thought of you. You'll understand why it's called Hot Protestants in a bit. And then John Bunyan, lots of things on John Bunyan. I'm almost afraid to ask, but I will. How many of you have read Pilgrim's Progress? It is one of those books that everyone should read, so there's lots of editions. This is a nice Penguin edition of Pilgrim's Progress with a nice introduction, a little biography. And then probably the second most important thing that Bunyan wrote, and this is a nice Oxford edition of it, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. This is his spiritual autobiography. There's a few curious parts about it, but if you want his own take on his long conversion experience, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. All right, lots of books. John Bunyan was born in 1628 in the village of Elstow, E-L-S-T-O-W, just outside of a small town, Bedford. And this is where he would spend most of his life. Bedford is maybe 50 miles north of London, 30 miles west of Cambridge, kind of heading up to the Midlands area of England. We don't know his exact birthday, but he was baptized as an infant. Bunyan is a Baptist. We'll come to that, although wasn't born a Baptist, but he became a Baptist. He was baptized as an infant on November 30. Bunyan's father, Thomas, was, and I know only half of you can see this board, he was a brazier, that is someone who works with brass, or Bunyan preferred the word which you've maybe heard before, a tinker. You think of a tinker, sort of what it sounds like, somebody who tinkers around. Well, a brazier or a tinker, this is what Bunyan's father did, and it's what Bunyan then did. It was almost like a traveling salesman who would go from house to house and working with brass would make brass pots and pans or say, do you have anything that needs to be repaired? Sort of a jack of all trades, a handyman, you might say, but in particular with pots and pans. He was not born into grinding poverty, but he certainly was far removed from any sort of privilege. We might say, to use our terminology, that he grew up in a working class family or lower middle class. And it's worth thinking of, this is week 7 in the class, to think about the other 6 men that we've looked at. And yes, we are going, well, next week I'm going to be gone. And Greg Salazar, and he'll be introduced, but Greg is doing a church plant in Myers Park. And Greg taught for many years at Puritan Seminary in Grand Rapids. He's from North Carolina. So Greg's going to be teaching this class next week. Joel May will introduce him. He's going to do John Owen. But when I come back, I'm going to do Susannah Wesley. So we are going to come to a woman in the class. But think about Bunyan compared to the 6 men that we've had so far. Only one of the men really grew up in wealth. That was obviously last week, William of Nassau. He inherited the Principality of Orange, and he became, at 11 years old, one of the richest noblemen in all of Europe. So he certainly grew up a part of the aristocracy. The other 5, remember, Luther, Zwingli, Cranmer, Calvin, Knox, none of them grew up in wealth. They grew up in some measure of rural or maybe middle class, but all of them had an excellent university education, and all of them, Luther, Zwingli, Cranmer, Calvin, Knox, if you remember those biographies, they all had education at a university and then were set on a career in either law or the church, which that or medicine, for a long time, been the 3 things that a professional man might do: law, medicine, or the church. So in comparison to everyone else we've seen, Bunyan had very little education. He briefly attended a local school where he learned to read and write, but after a few years, he left that school and he took up the trade that his father had done, was doing, and became a tinker. Bunyan's brilliance, and he is more read than anyone else in this class, meaning anyone else we cover in this class. His brilliance was not in deep, learned theology, but in communicating biblical truth to people's hearts and in a way that ordinary people can understand. If you pick up Pilgrim's Progress, most of you have read it already, though it was written 350 years ago, yes, there's some these and thous and th words, and it doesn't roll off just like a newspaper column, but you can really read it and understand it. He wrote with a simple, direct prose, and he was very effective at speaking to ordinary people, which people like us. From 1642 to 1648, we'll come back and say more about this in a bit, but these are the years of the English Civil War. As Americans, we know all about the American Civil War, and sometimes we forget that 200 years previous, there was a very bloody English Civil War, which pitted the Roundheads, they were the side of Parliament, against the Cavaliers, they were the Royalists. So it was the king and his forces against Parliament and their forces. And they were headed up by Oliver Cromwell, who had the New Model Army. It really is one of my favorite movies, and it's probably, it's not historically accurate in lots of ways, but from the 60s, you ever see the movie Cromwell? It has Richard Harris before he became Dumbledore. What's that? There's A Man for All Seasons. I also love that book. That is from the 60s. That movie with Sir Thomas More, same kind of time period. So the Cromwell. The English Civil War. In 1644, Bunyan volunteers for the parliamentary side. Actually, we don't know if he volunteered or he may have been conscripted as a part of the county-wide conscription. And he served in 1644 in the army. There's some evidence that in 1645, here I brought not quite wooden shoes, but that Bunyan was there at one of the most infamous battles in the Civil War, the Siege of Leicester. This is my Leicester City Foxes hat from the Premier League. They're not very good, but they did win the whole thing in 2016. I did my doctoral work at the University of Leicester, so I root for Leicester, which is there up in the Midlands. This tie I got when I was there. This is a very, very handsome University of Leicester tie. He was there, it seems, in 1645. Leicester was, it looks to us like Leicester, so don't say Leicester, but the Brits like to just erase a lot of letters in the middle of words. So Leicester was a stronghold for the parliamentary side, and when the king's forces attacked, the people inside fought back valiantly, but the royalist forces won, and then the drunken soldiers systematically looted the town, raped the women, killed hundreds. I mean, this wasn't a big town. It was 2,000-3,000 people, and they killed 600 or 700 people, so they killed maybe a third, a fourth of the town. And years later, not to spoil the end of it, but in 1649, King Charles is going to be beheaded, and one of the charges laid against him was the siege of Leicester and how he brutalized his own people. And Charles, and in this movie, Cromwell, Charles is played by Alec Guinness, Obi-Wan. So it's really, you have to sort of change your mind to think not of Obi-Wan, but it's really well done. Bunyan, in his book, Grace Abounding, mentions that in one occasion, and it's probably this, that he was to fight in the battle, but he says that a man stepped forward and agreed to take his place on the battlefield that day, or it would have been at this siege. And Bunyan says that the man was shot in the head with a musket ball and died. And Bunyan took it as a singular example of God's providence in his life, that someone else had died in his place, and he lived. In 1647, Bunyan's regiment is demobilized, and so he returns to Elstow, the little village outside of Bedford, and he resumes his work as a tinker. 1648 or 49, he gets married. Sadly, we don't know her name. They had 4 children together. She was not wealthy either. She brought into the marriage as a part of her dowry 2 books. Best thing you could bring as a dowry is some books. 2 books which Bunyan read and had a profound spiritual influence on his life. They awakened him to spiritual things. So we don't know a lot about Bunyan's life up to this point. He would have, like everyone, he was baptized as an infant, would have grew up in and around the Church of England, but there's no indication that he was any kind of Christian. So this awakened him to spiritual things. And he began a process that would last for 5 years of a long, drawn-out conversion. So 1649 to 53, or even all the way to 55, about 4, 5, 6 years is Bunyan's conversion, and that's what he writes chiefly about in this book, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. Once he was awakened, now we'll hear that language later with the Great Awakening, they used the language of awakening in the 17th and 18th century not to mean you were saved. So if someone was awakened, they didn't mean I was saved. It means they were awakened to the terrors of the law. They were awakened to their sinful state. So Bunyan tried to stop swearing. He was very open. One of his besetting sins from early in life was that he swore. He tried to keep the Sabbath. He started to attend church. He was trying to reform himself, and yet he didn't have peace with God. A famous part in his spiritual autobiography where he writes that he was walking around Bedford and he heard 3 or 4 poor women, washerwomen, talking about the grace of God. Here's what he writes. One day, while walking through Bedford, doing the work of a tinker, he overheard 3 or 4 women, quote, talking about the things of God. And being now willing to hear them discourse, I drew near to what they said, for their talk was about a new birth, the work of God on their hearts, also how they were convinced of their miserable state by nature. So he overhears these women. They're talking about being born again and about Christ's work in their hearts, and it so arrested Bunyan. He thought, I need that. I don't have that peace with God. The women introduced him to their pastor, which is a man named John Gifford, who was a pastor at the nonconformist church in Bedford. Now, hold that a minute. We'll define that a little bit later. Nonconformist. It basically means not a part of the Church of England. The pastor gave to him Luther's commentary on Galatians. If you know some of church history, you know how many times key people were awakened, converted, reformed by reading Luther's commentary on Galatians. So Bunyan was one of them. And later he reflects on having a Luther-like experience. Here's what he says in his autobiography. One day, I was passing into the field. This sentence fell upon my soul. Thy righteousness is in heaven. And methought, it's just good when we should really speak like that. Methought withal, I saw with the eyes of my soul Jesus Christ at God's right hand. There, I say, was my righteousness, so that wherever I was or whatever I was doing, God could not say of me, he lacks my righteousness, for that was just before him. I also saw, moreover, that it was not my good frame of heart that made me my righteousness better, nor my bad frame that made my righteousness worse. For my righteousness was Jesus Christ himself, the same yesterday, today, and forever. Now did my chains fall off my legs indeed. I was loosed from my afflictions and irons. My temptations fled away, so that from that time those dreadful scriptures of God left off to trouble me. Now I went home rejoicing for the grace and the love of God. It's very Luther-esque. He'd been fixated on the righteousness of God, and these words of God's holiness and wrath that terrified him. He now realizes, his eyes open, my righteousness is Christ. He stands before God, and that is what God sees, and he leaps for joy. He had joined John Gifford's church in 53, so I can say this conversion experience maybe goes till 53, or maybe a little past that. He has this experience that I just recounted in 54, and then in 1655, he becomes a full member at John Gifford's church, and he is baptized by immersion and joins the independent church there at Bedford. So maybe take a little parenthesis here to explain where Baptist tradition comes from. We were introduced with Zwingli and Luther to the Anabaptists. Anna is a prefix meaning again, so they were called Anabaptists because they believed that you had to be baptized again, that your infant baptism didn't count. And there's a lot of debate on, do Baptists come from Anabaptists? And most scholars think, while they would have read Anabaptist works and they would have been helped to come to the conclusion that you must be baptized as a believer, they weren't direct, we might say, ecclesiastical descendants from the Anabaptists, but rather the Baptist tradition comes out of the Church of England. The first Baptist church, if you read most Baptist histories, actually was in the Netherlands. Why in the Netherlands? Because where are people going if they want to have some greater measure of toleration? Well, a number of English immigrants moved to the Netherlands, and 1609, the first Baptist church, as it's usually marked, was formed under the leadership of the English separatist John Smith. If you really want to get Blair Smith on your bad side, just suggest that he might have been descended from Baptists. Just mention it to him. Well, there are lots of Smiths, of course. That group had gone to the Netherlands looking for greater toleration, and then in 1612, most of that church, they're Englishmen and women, comes back to England, and so John Smith, actually spelled with a Y, and then his sort of co-pastor at the church is a man named Thomas Helwys. He then becomes the pastor of the church in London. So 1609 in Amsterdam, and then 1612 in London, there is a Baptist church. Bunyan, somewhere here, no doubt being influenced by John Gifford, becomes convinced of baptism for adults by immersion. But if you talk to many Baptists today, they will say, well, Bunyan wasn't the best of Baptists. So he was baptized as an infant, and if you're a Baptist, you say, well, he couldn't help that. Well, true, but he also had his children baptized in the Anglican parish, and when he was a pastor, he advocated open membership. Now, this continues to be a debate in Baptist circles. I would say it's the minority position among Baptists. Open membership means that if you grew up, like many of us did, and you were baptized as an infant, and you still hold to infant baptism, you could join the Baptist church without being rebaptized. And maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was an open debate about this because John Piper was arguing for that open membership position. Most Baptists, like Mark Dever, Nine Marks folks, would argue very strongly, no, if you were baptized as an infant, that wasn't a baptism. You've never been baptized. And you can't join a church unless you've been baptized. You can't come to the Lord's table unless you've been baptized. And you weren't baptized because that happened when you were an infant, and that was not baptism because it was not joined to faith. Therefore, from a Presbyterian perspective, you say they're making you be rebaptized. From their perspective, they say, no, you need to be baptized for the first time. That is probably the majority opinion with Baptists. And sometimes parents have that angst if their kids move away or they go off to college and they are with a good Baptist church, and the Baptist church says, well, if you're going to be a member here, your infant baptism doesn't count. You need to be rebaptized or baptized for the first time. Bunyan had a more open view, and if you're a Presbyterian, you might say, oh, it was really good of John Bunyan. Most Baptists will say, well, we like Bunyan, he's one of ours, but he was wrong on that. Soon after becoming a full member of the church in Bedford, Bunyan started, they would say, offering words of exhortation. Really, he started preaching. And he was a good preacher, quickly attracted a crowd. He earned the reputation of really being able to reach men's hearts. He started publishing some religious works. He had a polemical work against the Quakers, an evangelistic sermon denouncing the rich. His most significant doctrinal work was published in this time, a work on law and grace. In 1658, his first wife died, leaving him with 4 children. The next year, he marries his second wife, Elizabeth. So Bunyan is out there. He's recently converted. He joins the church in 1655, remarried in 1659, and he's preaching. And we might say, again, if we're thinking like Presbyterians, well, that's good. It's good that he wants to speak. You know, it might be good for you to get some education, maybe to get licensed, to move towards ordination. So we might think it's a little irregular, but we'd probably say, hey, that's great that he's wanting to teach the Bible to people, and folks want to come to hear him. They're listening in barns, they're listening in people's homes, they're listening in the fields. Well, this was not allowed. There was a new government in England in 1660, and we're going to circle back and explain how we got here. But in 1660, King Charles II is on the throne. And the English government sees people like Bunyan as a threat to good order and possibly insurrectionists. You are not allowed to preach unless you're a part of the Church of England, unless you're licensed, unless you're in one of the structures of the Church of England. So on November 12, 1660, Bunyan is arrested. He's arrested on several charges. He's not attending the established church, the Anglican Church. He's conducting an illegal church meeting, and he's preaching. They called them conventicles, a small group, an illegal church meeting in somebody's home or in some barn or some public place. Actually, I think there's an inn in there, conventicles. When he showed up to preach on November 12, he was told by a local magistrate who didn't really want Bunyan to get in trouble. He says, look, John, there's a warrant for your arrest. You can't do this anymore. Why don't you just, lay low, not go ahead with this service? And Bunyan's reply, by no means. I will not, sir. Neither will I have the meeting dismissed. Come, be of good cheer. Let us be not daunted. Our cause is good. We need not be ashamed of it to preach God's word. It is so good a work. We shall be rewarded even if we suffer for that. And so, against the advice of the local magistrate and against the counsel even of some of his friends, he insists on preaching, and on November 12, 1660, he is put in prison for being an illegal preacher, and he will remain in prison for 12 years. All right, how did we get to this point? So if this is the movie of John Bunyan's life, now we got to go and have a long series of flashbacks. I'm going to leave you there with a little, what happens to John Bunyan? He's in prison in 1660. How did we get to this point? Well, we're going to come back to Bunyan at the end, but this is where I want to tell you about the Puritans, and that's going to intersect with something that will be familiar to most of us, which is the Westminster Assembly. So in order to understand why Bunyan is in prison, we need to understand something about Protestantism in England, and that has everything to do with the Puritans. In 1564, this is as far as we can tell, 1564 is the first time that this new insult is lodged at some men in the Church of England. They have the audacity not to wear the liturgical vestments, and they rail against church hierarchy, and they don't like that somebody is telling them, here's the prescribed church service, just the way you have to do it. And these men who are complaining of these things in the Church of England are called Puritans. Now, today we hear that from our vantage point. We think, well, we love the Puritans. But it was, of course, an insult. It was its own brand of religiosity. Zealous, pious, critical of the established church, eager to see the Church of England more fully reformed in doctrine, in morals, and in worship. Maybe the most useful and memorable definition of Puritanism comes from a modern historian, though he was borrowing from a phrase that was around this time, called them, quote, the hotter sort of Protestants. That's why I told you this book is called Hot Protestants. The Puritans were those hotter sort of Protestants. Again, just own it. Own it for yourself. We are the hotter sort of Protestants. We can tell these people are really zealous. Sometimes they were called super Protestants. I'll own that. Perfect Protestants, not so much. Or they represented, quote, the militant tendency of Protestantism. The Puritans So Protestants, normally they were Reformed, Calvinists, though there are some Arminians. They were, some of them in the Church of England, there were some outside the Church of England, and those were divided between Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and later Baptists. And Baptists are quickly divided between particular Baptists. Let me say, if you're a Baptist here, you want to be a particular Baptist. No, the particular Baptists are the Calvinistic Baptists, and then the general Baptists. So these were the groups who were outside of the Church of England. Puritanism is a bit hard to define. It doesn't stay in England. It spills out to Ireland and Wales. If you think about many people, like in this book by Joel Beakey, Meet the Puritans, there's Scottish Presbyterians who are Puritans. Well, certainly many Scotsmen and women were reading the Puritans at this time. It's a little bit of a misnomer to call them Puritans because the Presbyterians in Scotland are the established church. So they don't have to rail against the established church. They are the established church in Scotland. So were there Scottish Puritans? Yes and no. Certainly the same kind of vibe and energy. There were same kind of ideas in the Netherlands. And most famously, from our perspective, those Puritans, many of them left for the New World. And in New England, Congregationalists, remember Presbyterians believe in a regional body of authority. The Presbytery, Congregationalists has to do with polity. They believe that the congregation is the ultimate level of church authority. So the Puritans would have cultural, political, spiritual power for 100 years in New England, from 1620 to the middle part of the 1700s. By some accounts, the Puritans go from, if you wanted to have some easy to remember dates, you could say the age of the Puritans is exactly 200 years. 1558, anyone remember what happened? Somebody died in 1558. Bloody Mary. So the Catholic queen died, and then Queen Elizabeth. And then in 1758, we haven't got here yet, but somebody else died. That's Jonathan Edwards. So convenient dates, if you want to think about 200 years, this is when Bloody Mary dies, and then that's when Edwards died. Now what's significant about 1558 is that Queen Elizabeth I comes to power. She's a Protestant. That's very good. Now remember, she's upset with Knox. She doesn't like his monstrous trumpet blast against the regiment of women. She wants to steer away from the Cranmer Reformed style, and she has more of a via media, a little more of a middle road, which is why these Puritans start bubbling up, the hotter sort of Protestants, because the Elizabethan settlement, as it's called, just the way Protestantism develops in England under Elizabeth, is more latitudinarian. It's a good Scrabble word, just more latitude. It's more moderate. 1758, Jonathan Edwards died. If you want to have some more specific dates, again, 1559, you can remember this too, to 1689. Well, Bloody Mary dies, Elizabeth is on the throne. In 1559, something is issued called the Act of Uniformity. And it is just what it sounds like. It is insisting that the church in England must be uniform. So this is not the time to allow for, in fact, hardly anybody in Europe can even imagine that your realm would have multiple religious options. Seems just natural to us. It was very unnatural to them. So Act of Uniformity, everyone has to be Protestant. Well, that's good for the Protestants, but it's this via media Church of England. 1689 is the Act of Toleration under William and Mary. Remember William III, again, just 3 cheers for the Dutch, came over to be the king with Mary in England. So the Act of Toleration. So in 1689, you can see Bunyan's dates. He died right before he really would have had full legal authority to not be an Anglican. And even that term Anglican was really a little anachronistic, Church of England. So Act of Uniformity in 1559, Act of Toleration. So during this period is where there is ups and downs of persecution, or persecution may be too strong a word usually, at least suppression of these nonconformist groups. So this word, nonconformist, or you sometimes see this word, dissenter, is just someone who does not conform to the Church of England. A dissenter is someone who dissents from the strictures and the structures of the Church of England. So beginning in 1559, except for a small time period which we're coming to, Presbyterians would be nonconformists in England. They're the established church in Scotland. They're nonconformists. They're dissenters. So when you see those terms, just think Protestant groups who are not a part of the Church of England. In London, there were 15 to 20% of the population was nonconformist. So this was a significant minority throughout the country. In the last 50 or 60 years, there has been a great revival of interest in the Puritans. Men like William Perkins, John Owen, John Flavel, Jeremiah Burroughs, Richard Sibbes, Thomas Watson, Thomas Goodwin, Richard Baxter, Thomas Brooks, Joseph Eileen, Stephen Charnock. These men disagreed on many things, but they all shared an emphasis on personal communion with God, the supremacy of the Bible, human inability, the need for divine grace, and the power of the Holy Spirit to live a holy life. So it's during this 130 years in particular that we're talking about this Puritan movement that's insisting that the Church of England is not as pure as it should be. Some of them are within the Church of England, some of them are outside the Church of England. Now, in order to understand, again, why Bunyan is in prison, we need to come back to the English Civil War. Remember, this is 1642 to 1648. In 1603, you have King James I. He was James VI of Scotland. So the crowns of Scotland and England are united, and James VI of Scotland becomes James I. Now, since he was from Scotland, he was raised as a Presbyterian. He wasn't probably very devout or serious about being a Presbyterian, but at least he had that as his background. He was not interested in promoting Presbyterianism. He was not interested in siding with the Puritans. His one concession that James I made to the Puritans was to say, all right, I'll call some people together at my Hampton court, my palace in 1611, and you can make a new translation of the Bible. You've heard of it. The King James Bible from James I, 1611. For most of his reign, however, though James was not interested in helping out Reformed Christians, for most of his reign, his Archbishop of Canterbury was a man named George Abbot, and Abbot was a Calvinist. And if you're going to have bad ideas, at least, or be a bad person, at least have some good people around you. So that was Abbot. He kept James, his worst instincts, at bay, and he was a lot better than his son. So Charles I, he takes the throne when his father dies in 1625. So things were not ideal under James I, but they were okay. His son Charles was especially reviled. He was not raised as a Presbyterian, didn't have his father's political skill, and Charles I made two very fateful decisions. One was his wife He married Henrietta Maria of France. Whew. Don't marry those French women. At least not this one. She was Catholic, and she insisted on practicing her Roman Catholicism. She had her own priests. Now, this is a Protestant country. You're a Protestant king of a Protestant people, and you have a Catholic wife, and she has her popish prelates in the king's palace. So that was one thing, was his wife was Catholic. The other fateful decision he made was his archbishop. So abbot under James, but now we have a man named William Laud. And if we were Presbyterians making a movie, which is not what Presbyterians often are best at, but when Laud came on the screen, you would have the Imperial Death March. You would have some Darth Vader music. He's a bad guy. Up to 1630, the Church of England was still dominated by a lot of Calvinists. The Synod of Dort is 16, 18, and 19, and there's an influential British delegation there of Calvinists. But this changed when Laud is made the archbishop in 1633. And he hates the Calvinists. He didn't like that they were so connected to other parts of the continent, to the Netherlands, to the Huguenots in France, to the Swiss cantons. He didn't like that. He didn't like their view on the sacraments, and he really, really didn't like that they disagreed with the Anglican system of bishops. When we hear church polity, you think, that's maybe like number 10 on the list of important doctrines. But during this time, church polity is about number 1, because church polity has to do with who is in charge. And the system in the Church of England is that you have bishops. Now think about it. If you have a state church and you're the king or you're the archbishop, you get to appoint other bishops who get to appoint the priests. This is a lot of control to have. So about the worst thing that can happen is to get rid of the rule by bishops and have something like Congregationalists want every congregation to decide, or Presbyterians want local presbyteries to decide. He considers this very dangerous. He insisted on absolute allegiance to the king. He started to reintroduce some of the more Catholic rites and rituals in the church. He did away with the freedom of conscience. And in 1633, here's a bit of history which will help make sense of something. He reissues this book called the Book of Sports. Now, why is that so controversial? It had already been out, but he reissues and pushes this, the Book of Sports, which is insisting upon people playing sports on Sunday. Now, this is just an intentional finger in the eye of the Puritans. When we come in the 1640s to the Westminster Confession, one of the reasons, see, for example, like the Heidelberg Catechism is much less Sabbatarian. That's 1563. The Heidelberg Catechism calls Sunday a festive day of rest, which I've always liked. It's a festive day of rest. When you come to the Westminster Assembly with the Puritans, they have all this history. They have Laud trying to tell people, go play sports on Sunday. He started probably like a youth soccer travel team and travel baseball and all the rest. And so the Puritans know what he's doing. He's poking them in the eye, telling people. He cut off the ears of a Puritan nonconformist named William Prynne. He had his face branded with hot irons. So people are thinking, this is going to be Bloody Mary again. In the 1630s, 13,000 immigrants left for America, freedom, and disease and wilderness and all the rest. John Cotton, Thomas Hooker, Thomas Shepard, these are famous Puritan preachers who leave England, go to the New World. In 1630, you'll remember John Winthrop with the fleet of ships led by the Arbella. John Winthrop of A City on a Hill fame. Can't tell you how many times somebody will send something to me and say, I know you did your dissertation on this. I thought you'd want to see this article about John Winthrop and the City on a Hill. And I say, no, John Witherspoon, not John Winthrop. But I like John Winthrop too. King Charles is increasingly unpopular. He enrages the Scots. You don't want to enrage the Scots. Because in 1637, he reintroduces episcopacy, that is, rule by bishops. One of the reasons Presbyterianism made sense in Scotland, just think of what you know. You know, if you don't know Scottish history, just think of the movie Brave, and you have all the clans. Presbyterianism made sense to a country that was used to being ruled by local clans, families. So it made sense. You got presbyteries. That's kind of what we do. We got the McDougall things over here, and we got the whatever Max over here. Well, he does away with the Presbyterian system, introduces bishops, which leads to the signing of the National Covenant in 1638, and then open warfare in 1640. This is where you get in the Presbyterian tradition the Covenanters. These were men who were persecuted in Scotland, who covenanted together, said, we covenant to be a Christian nation, and we will fight against the king. Charles had suspended the House of Commons, but now he was at war with Scotland, and he needed money. So how do you get money? Well, Parliament has the purse strings, so he has to call Parliament. His advisor said, don't do this, Chuck. Parliament is not going to like you, but he needs money. And when he calls Parliament, not only do they not give him money for his war, but they dismantle episcopacy in England. So take that, king. On January 4, 1642, and this is very dramatically, you go find this on YouTube from the movie Cromwell. January 4, 1642, Charles enters the House of Commons, which was an unconstitutional act, because he wasn't supposed to come in there except summoned. So by this point, there's this very uneasy balance between who really is in control, the monarch or Parliament. And he comes in and he seeks to arrest 5 members of Parliament, but they're told ahead of time to flee, that the king is coming. And the Speaker of the House, William Linthal, is asked by the king, so this is his king, who asks the Speaker of the House, tell me, where are these 5 men? He's come to arrest them as insurrectionists. And the Speaker of the House gives this famous reply. May it please your majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the House is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am. It may not sound like important words, but they are some of the most important words in British history, because he says very politely, as a Brit would do, he says to the king, nope, I am not going to tell my king where these 5 men are, because I answer above the king to Parliament. Unless Parliament gives me permission, I cannot answer you, king. This was considered one of the great statements of resisting authoritarianism and tyranny. On August 22, 1642, Charles raises the flag, the royal standard, at Nottingham, and civil war had begun. So civil war from 1642 to 1648. The parliamentary forces win, so that in 1649, as I said, in London, Charles I is beheaded. And in the movie you can read hear the famous words that I go from a corruptible crown, he says, to an incorruptible crown. Well, it's during this time, in the 1640s, that Parliament summons an assembly. They summon an assembly of divines to give ecclesiastical and doctrinal advice. Running out of room, but from 1643 to 52, so this is during and then after the Civil War is when the Westminster Assembly meets. Ironically, it was not actually a church council. It had no authority of its own. It was called by Parliament to assist and give theological advice to Parliament. And they were trying to bring together the Kingdom of Wales and Scotland and England under one theological rubric. So it's during this with the Westminster Assembly in 1646 and then in 1647 that the divines release the Westminster Confession of Faith and then the larger and shorter catechisms. Now, they continue to meet because they do other things. They ordain people, they issue other sorts of papers, they have lots of committees, of course they would. But from this, 1646, 1647, as I've said many times, one of the most successful and abysmal failures in church history was the Westminster Assembly. It was an utter failure because as we're coming here to the end of the story, by 1660, the reign of Oliver Cromwell is over. Cromwell dies in 1658. They wanted to make him king, but he was not king. He was the Lord Protectorate. So during these years in the 1650s, England is actually a republic. They don't have a king. They're not a monarchy. They're a commonwealth, and they're really a Puritan commonwealth with a Presbyterian doctrine of faith. But by 1660, all of that is wiped away. And today there are hardly any, though we support lots of good works there, but there are really hardly any Presbyterians in England. More Presbyterians will be here at Christ Covenant this morning than will be worshiping in all of England. That's true. So in one way, you say it's an abysmal failure, and yet an unbelievable success in that still, coming up on 400 years later, and boy, what a party we're going to have. Chad Van Dixhoorn's he's going to have a great party for all of us when we get to the 400th anniversary, Lord willing. Some of us will still be here to celebrate this. So they never could have dreamt that 400 years later there would be churches in America. Now that was starting to happen, but there would be churches in Seoul, South Korea, Brazil, all over the world who have as their doctrinal standards the Westminster Confession and Catechisms. So in 1660, and here we will speed ahead to the end of Bunyan's story. So after the Civil War, and for just about 10 years, so Charles is killed in 1649, and then Cromwell is the Lord Protectorate, England is a republic, but in we got a different color. Very fitting, a royalist color. We have Charles II, his son. And this is called in English history the Restoration. It's the restoration of the monarchy. So remember, Bunyan's arrested in 1660 because what's happened? We're not in a Puritan age. Now, it's still Puritans are doing their thing, but now we have a new king. And laws are passed, punitive anti-Puritan legislation. There is a new Act of Uniformity in 1662, and this leads to what is called the Great Ejection. Thousands of Puritan pastors have to leave their congregations. So they have this window of about 10 years where they're in control, and they're in the Church of England, and then a new Act of Uniformity, and they have to leave. Some capitulated, many left, some went to the New World. Bunyan is not allowed to preach. He's not licensed to preach by any sort of ecclesiastical hierarchy. And he was warned of it, but he insisted to preach, and so he was thrown into prison. Now, what was this prison like? It wasn't a dungeon, but nothing was very nice in 1660 if you were an ordinary person, and a prison certainly wasn't nice. It's a prison cell, maybe a block window, cold in the winter, sleep on a bed of straw. He was blessed with good health to survive 12 years in prison. He was known to all of the prison guards, and people visited him for being of good cheer. He said, remarkably, he was lacking in all bitterness. Now, it's interesting to think, what would you have done? What would I have done? Because this is not like persecution 100 years ago under Bloody Mary. They're not telling him to recant. They're not telling him to sign, like Cranmer, a statement recanting all his views. All they want is for him to say, I won't preach. Okay, there's Protestant preaching in the Church of England, but he says, I'm called to preach, and I can preach where I want, when I want. We don't know exactly what it was like with his wife, but you can imagine his wife saying, just, what good you're not preaching to a lot of people there. You can preach to not a lot of people and be with us and the kids. But he was, you might call him a conscientious objector. Most of the people, he was really the longest imprisoned person. People said he was the first person to be imprisoned under Charles, and he was the last person to be released. So he was imprisoned from 1660 to 1672. By 1672, Charles is losing grip on power, and he issues forth an act of indulgence, not like Catholic indulgences, but an act of indulgence where he says, by his eminence and his grace, he's now giving greater freedom to nonconformists. And so finally, Bunyan can be released in the summer of 1672. He made shoelaces to try to support his family. Man, that seems like a hard way. It's like peeling potatoes, making license plates. I don't know if people do that, but he made shoelaces to try to support his family. Now, in God's providence, what did he do when he was in prison? He really had two books. The Bible. Anyone want to guess? What was the other book he had? Just Do Something by Kevin. No, I didn't have that book. What other book? Thomas Cranmer is a good guess. He was writing Pilgrim's Progress. He had a book we've mentioned a few times before. He had Fox's Book of Martyrs. That's a good book to have while you're in prison. And he wrote his spiritual autobiography. He wrote most of Pilgrim's Progress. And by the time he's released, and it should be said that a little bit like Mayberry, sometimes the jailer would let him go home on the weekend. Who was the drunk in Mayberry? So Bunyan wasn't drunk, but yeah. So sometimes he'd like, here you go, come back, and he'd always come back on Monday morning. He'd get a few little reprieves here or there. He'd tell the local people in Bedford, he wasn't a villain to them, but they just had to do their job. So he's released in 1672. And because he was something of a celebrity by then. He was a living martyr who, for the sake of his Protestant nonconformist convictions, remained in prison for 12 years. Well, even before he's released, he is voted to be the pastor at the church in Bedford. How's that? They had a lot of confidence in him. They licensed him to preach while he was still in prison, and he got out and he became the pastor at this Baptist church in Bedford. And he was an effective preacher. John Owen, who you'll hear about next week, may be the most brilliant Puritan theologian of the 17th century, famously said he would gladly exchange all of his learning to be able to reach the hearts of men like John Bunyan did. And, here we'll end, the most famous thing he did, it didn't come out, but most of it he wrote in prison, is Pilgrim's Progress. He used a plain, straightforward, heartfelt, memorable style. He introduces the work as a dream. He uses that famous, now to us, I dreamed a dream. That's how he begins. It's the story of Christian pilgrim who is fleeing the city of destruction, trying to make it to heaven, and he has to go through many obstacles, and he meets many people. And then the second part of the book is Christiana, his wife, going on the same dangerous journey. There's a wonderful children's version of this called Dangerous Journey. Read it to your kids. There's all sorts of famous lines. Dark clouds bring waters when the bright clouds bring none. Think about that in your own life. There's famous characters, language. Think of some of these things that have just come into our English language. The Slough of Despond, Vanity Fair. There was a book by William Thackeray. There's a magazine. That was a scene in Pilgrim's Progress. Valiant for Truth, worldly wise, giant despair, the delectable mountains, little faith, doubting castle, the valley of humiliation, Mr. Standfast. All of these. One of the most famous scenes, he says, I saw in my dream that the highway which Christian was to go was fenced on either side with a wall, and the wall was called salvation. Up this way did burdened Christian run, but not without great difficulty because of the load on his back. You remember this? His load on his back. He ran thus till he came to a place, and upon that place stood a cross, and below the cross a sepulchre, a grave. And I saw in my dream, just as Christian came up with the cross, his burden loosed from off his shoulders and fell down off his back and began to tumble, and so continued till it came to the mouth of the sepulchre, and it fell in, and I saw it no more. Pilgrim's Progress was not just spiritually edifying. It influenced the English language, the English novel. Thackeray, Dickens, the Bronte sisters, Twain, Louisa May Alcott all show signs of indebtedness to Bunyan. So the first part was published in 1678. John Owen arranged for his own publisher to print it. The second part came out in 1684. It was an immediate bestseller. Sometimes these books that we hear of just eventually, but this one immediately was a bestseller. It went through 12 editions. It was immediately translated into Dutch and French and Welsh. In the first decade it was released, it sold more than 100,000 copies. It has now been translated into over 200 languages. It has never been out of print. It can be found in 1,500 editions. It is often, after you translate the New Testament into a tribal language, missionaries would translate Pilgrim's Progress. After the Bible, Pilgrim's Progress is the best-selling book of all time. So score one for the Baptists. The best-selling book of all time. Bunyan died in 1688. He had contracted a fever. He was riding horse in the rain from Reading, which is now a far-out suburb, to London. He was riding to London to counsel a father and son who were at odds with one another, and he wanted to try to reconcile them. It's quite fitting to think that Bunyan died engaging or attempting to engage in the work of reconciliation. Because this book, Pilgrim's Progress, is really that story of reconciliation, of finding freedom and salvation in Christ. He was buried in Bunhill Fields in London, not far from John Owen, who died shortly before. A sad fitting, only 60 years old, but he had done so much to introduce people to the path whereby they might be reconciled to God and make it safely to the celestial city. So perhaps it is a good fitting conclusion to this lecture to recount what Christian, that is Pilgrim, says to obstinate. That's one of the characters. At the beginning of the book, he says to obstinate, to stubborn, I seek a place that can never be destroyed, one that is pure, and that fadeth not away, and it is laid up in heaven, and safe there, to be given at the time appointed to them that seek it with all their heart. Read it so, if you will, in my book. And so we find it in Pilgrim's Progress.